What do you do when the people sharing your blood lock you out in a minus 15 degrees Celsius blizzard just so their youngest daughter can have a yoga studio? They thought tossing a single mother and her 1-year-old son into the freezing night would make me beg. But they made two fatal mistakes. First, my baby was already safe. Second, they had no idea what Grandpa left me. Grab your coffee. Hello, dear listeners of Maya Revenge Stories. We are so incredibly grateful for your continuous support. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with no budget to operate, meaning we will soon have to stop publishing new public videos on this platform. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us by joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon, where you can hear even better, longer, and more detailed exclusive true stories with multiple emotional voice actors that we simply cannot make public on YouTube, which you can do by scanning the QR code on your screen or clicking the Patreon link in the description or pinned comment of this video. Let us dive into today's story, told from the perspective of our main character, Mariana Riley. The wind howled through the towering pines of Aspen, whipping loose snow against my face like thousands of tiny, freezing needles. It was minus 15 degrees Celsius outside, a historic blizzard that was rapidly burying the greater Denver area under a thick, suffocating blanket of white. I am 32 years old, a senior risk analyst whose entire career is built on predicting human failures and financial catastrophes before they can happen. Yet, as I stood shivering on the grand porch of the massive wooden mansion I had once called home, I realized the most spectacular human failure of all was standing right in front of me, wrapped in designer cashmere. My mother, Eleanor, stood safely behind the threshold, her arms crossed tight against her chest. Beside her was my stepfather, Richard. With a violent shove, Richard kicked my only heavy suitcase out onto the freezing wooden planks of the porch. The heavy luggage hit the ice with a dull, hollow thud that echoed into the howling night. "You need to vacate the guest house immediately," Eleanor declared, her voice colder than the storm raging around us. There was no hesitation, no flicker of maternal concern, just pure, calculated malice. "Harper needs the space. She's expanding her brand, and that guest house is the only place with the right natural light to knock down the walls for her new indoor yoga vlog studio." I stared at her, letting the sheer absurdity of her words sink into the freezing air. A yoga vlog studio? They were throwing me out into a deadly winter tempest so my spoiled younger sister could have more room to stretch on camera. Eleanor reached into the pocket of her expensive coat and casually tossed a crumpled piece of paper at my boots. The violent wind caught it briefly, but it stuck to the snow near my feet. It was a torn, cheap roadside motel discount coupon. "Take it," Eleanor sneered, looking at me as if I were a piece of trash that had washed up on her pristine driveway. "It is the least I can do for the ultimate family disappointment. You had every opportunity. You could have married into ultra wealth, secured your future and ours. But no, you had to play the stubborn rebel and become a single mother. Look where your pathetic independence got you." Through the massive, floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the mansion, I could see the roaring fire in the grand living room hearth. The golden, warm light bathed the expensive leather furniture and the plush rugs. Lounging carelessly on the velvet sofa were my younger sister, Harper, and her aggressively parasitic husband, Liam. They were the picture of unearned luxury. I watched them raise crystal glasses filled with a very rare, expensive vintage wine. It was a bottle I had purchased with my own hard-earned money just 2 months prior. Harper pointed an impeccably manicured finger in my direction, her shoulders shaking as she laughed at my predicament. Liam grinned, taking a long sip of my wine, thoroughly enjoying the spectacle of my eviction. They were safe, warm, and reveling in my supposed destruction. Eleanor and Richard stood tall in the doorway, waiting. They were waiting for my shoulders to drop. They were waiting for the tears to stream down my frozen cheeks. They fully expected me to drop to my knees in the snow, crying and begging for them to let me stay for the sake of my child. They thought throwing a single mother out into a freezing night would break my spirit entirely. But they had made two fatal mistakes. First, as a risk analyst, I never walk into a volatile situation without thoroughly calculating the odds and neutralizing the threats. I knew my family was greedy, selfish, and entirely devoid of empathy. I had anticipated this exact brand of cruelty days ago. What Eleanor, Richard, and Harper did not know was that my 1-year-old son, Leo, was nowhere near this freezing mountain. Early this morning, before the clouds even began to darken, I had secretly hired a premium, highly trained private nanny. She had already safely escorted my baby boy to a luxurious 5-star resort penthouse in the very center of downtown Denver. Right at this moment, Leo was securely tucked into a heated plush bed, drinking warm milk, perfectly safe and entirely untouched by their wickedness. Second, they had absolutely no idea what was actually happening behind the scenes of this ridiculous display of power. I did not give them the satisfaction of a single tear. I did not utter a single word of protest or beg for a shred of mercy. Instead, I simply reached down with my gloved hand, gripped the freezing handle of my suitcase, and turned my back on the people who shared my blood. I walked straight away from the grand porch and into the blinding white snow, as the heavy custom oak doors slammed shut behind me, locking me out in the deadly storm. A sharp, terrifying smile crept onto my lips. I felt a surge of absolute clarity as I remembered the phone call I had received from the personal lawyer of my late grandfather Harrison just a few hours ago. Let them laugh. Let them drink my wine and enjoy the warmth of their stolen fire tonight. Tomorrow, I was going to burn their entire fake empire to the ground. The blinding snow slammed against the reinforced windshield of my armored vehicle, but inside the cabin, there was only a dead, heavy silence. The drive down the treacherous mountain pass should have been terrifying, but my pulse was completely steady. While my family was busy celebrating my supposed demise by their roaring fire, I was navigating the deserted, ice-covered streets of downtown Denver, heading straight toward the absolute center of my power. I pulled into the heavily fortified, subterranean parking garage of a towering glass and steel skyscraper. This imposing structure was the headquarters of Aetherius Capital Management. To the public and the broader financial sector, it was an elite, notoriously secretive asset management firm that handled the wealth of billionaires. To the highly restricted board of directors, I was the shadow managing director, the invisible architect guiding their most aggressive market acquisitions. I bypassed the opulent main lobby, using a retinal scan and biometric clearance to access the private executive elevator. The heavy steel doors slid open silently, depositing me into the secure, soundproof suite of my corner office. Waiting for me in the dim, ambient glow of the city lights was Vance, sharp-featured, relentless, and possessing a mind like a steel trap. Vance was not just a brilliant corporate attorney, he was my closest confidant and the sworn executor of my late grandfather Harrison's estate. Vance stood up, his tailored suit immaculate despite the late hour, and slid a heavy black leather folder across the polished mahogany conference table. "You look exactly like a woman who just walked out of an execution," Vance said, his tone deadpan but laced with genuine, calculating respect. "Close enough," I replied, shedding my snow-soaked coat and tossing it onto a leather chair. They kicked me out and tossed my luggage into the ice, just like our risk models projected. They truly believe they hold all the leverage. Vance allowed a razor-thin, dangerous smile to cross his face. They do not even own the floorboards they are standing on. He opened the heavy folder, revealing stacks of legal documents stamped with high-level federal seals. Your grandfather was old, Mariana, but his mind was sharper than a scalpel until his very last breath. He knew exactly what was happening behind the grand doors of that Aspen estate. He hired elite forensic accountants during his final 3 years. He tracked every single cent of Richard's reckless, arrogant spending. He knew Richard was secretly funneling millions of the family's liquid assets to fund Liam's delusional, non-existent technology startups. And he watched Eleanor turn a blind eye to all of it, showering Harper with endless financial favors while treating you like a defective corporate asset. I leaned over the desk, tracing the bold signature of the man who had taught me everything I knew about surviving the brutal world of wealth. So, he bypassed the standard inheritance laws. Exactly, Vance nodded, tapping a specific, highlighted clause in the dense contract. Harrison knew that if he left you the estate in a traditional will, Richard and Eleanor would immediately contest it. They would drag you into probate court for a decade and bleed the accounts dry using corporate litigation tactics. So, your grandfather executed a phantom transfer. Months before his passing, Harrison quietly moved the total ownership of the Aspen Mountain estate, along with the entire commercial real estate portfolio, into an impenetrable, independent blind trust. Vance slid the final, thick parchment page toward me. The title of the financial entity was printed in bold, undeniable ink at the top. Leo's Shield. He had named the ultimate weapon after my 1-year-old son. As of midnight tonight, Vance continued, his voice dropping into a register of pure, undeniable legal authority. The transition period has officially concluded. You are the sole, 100% owner and executive director of Leo's Shield. That means the grand Aspen mansion they just kicked you out of. You own the timber, the bricks, and the dirt it sits on. Eleanor, Richard, Harper, and Liam are currently trespassing on your private property. The sheer gravity of the revelation settled over my shoulders like an armor of solid titanium. The people who had just thrown me into a lethal blizzard with a torn motel coupon were living as squatters in my house. But the true beauty of Grandfather's trap was not just the real estate. There is one more detail, Vance said, seamlessly sliding a glowing digital tablet across the desk. Their extravagant lifestyle, the vintage wines they are drinking tonight, the designer clothes, the luxury vehicles, it is all tethered to corporate credit accounts guaranteed by the overarching portfolio of Aetherius Capital Management, which means they are spending your money. I looked down at the tablet. It displayed the active financial network of my arrogant family. Glowing green dots represented the 15 supplementary credit cards Richard and Harper swiped on a daily basis without a second thought. They were bleeding my company's credit lines to fund their toxic illusions of grandeur. My fingers hovered over the master control terminal built into the surface of my desk. The time for silent observation was over. It was time to cut the oxygen supply to their fake empire. Vance, patch my terminal directly into the Aetherius Capital Management mainframe server, I ordered, my voice steady, professional, and completely devoid of mercy. I accessed the master administrative override system. With a few swift, precise keystrokes, I highlighted all 15 supplementary credit cards, along with the primary payment accounts Richard used to pay his exclusive country club fees and Liam's hidden gambling debts. Initiate total financial lockdown, I said aloud, pressing my finger down on the final execute key. Instantly, the glowing green dots on the tablet blinked once, then turned a harsh, flashing red. Terminated, frozen, denied. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the red lights as the storm raged against the reinforced glass of my office window. Tomorrow morning, they were going to wake up in my house, utterly bankrupt, without a single functioning piece of plastic to their names. 24 hours after the blizzard passed, the artificial warmth of their stolen empire instantly froze over. Their financial drought was not a slow leak. It was a sudden, violent evaporation of their entire reality. Harper was the first to hit the invisible glass wall. She was standing at the polished marble counter of Denver's most exclusive jewelry boutique, flanked by 2 of her wealthiest socialite friends. She was trying to purchase a matching set of diamond tennis bracelets, loudly celebrating her newly acquired space for her yoga studio. The clerk, a woman trained to mask judgment behind a polite smile, swiped Harper's heavy metal black card. The machine emitted a sharp, highly noticeable red beep. Declined. Harper let out an arrogant, breathy laugh, waving her manicured hand dismissively. She told the clerk to try it again, loudly blaming the boutique's outdated payment system. The clerk swiped it a second time, then a third. The machine flashed the exact same unforgiving red warning. The silence in the boutique became incredibly loud. Harper's friends exchanged a knowing, venomous glance. In the ultra-rich circles of Aspen and Denver, a declined black card was not a banking error, it was the absolute scent of death. Harper snatched the plastic from the clerk, her face burning a deep, humiliating crimson, and practically ran out of the store, leaving her dignity shattered on the marble floor. Meanwhile, high above the bustling streets of downtown Denver, I was sitting comfortably in the sunlit dining room of my five-star penthouse. My son, Leo, was giggling happily on a plush, heated rug, playing with a set of wooden building blocks. I sat at the glass dining table, taking a slow, peaceful sip of warm Earl Grey tea as I watched my secure laptop monitor. I had an administrative dashboard open, giving me a live, front-row seat to their sheer panic. The screen continuously populated with bright red notifications. A $60 artisanal coffee charge, denied. A $400 luxury spa reservation, denied. A $12,000 country club membership renewal, denied. At that exact moment, Richard was likely pacing the grand living room of my mountain estate, screaming violently into his cell phone. I could perfectly picture the veins bulging in his neck as he cursed out various bank managers, entirely convinced that a massive, systemic technical failure was occurring. He demanded they fix the machine error immediately. He had no idea that the system was working flawlessly and that his stepdaughter was personally supervising every single rejection from a leather chair miles away. The sudden lack of funds acted like acid on the fragile bonds of their household. Liam, who had been lounging lazily by the fire the night before, suddenly transformed into a cornered rat. His panic was not about luxury, it was about survival. He owed $50,000 to a very dangerous syndicate of underground sports bookies. The grace period for his gambling debt was evaporating, and the cash advances he relied on were suddenly entirely blocked. I watched an ATM withdrawal attempt for $10,000 pop up on my screen and immediately fail. Liam burst into the mansion, his face pale and sweating, and immediately turned his terror into aggression. He cornered Harper, violently blaming her for the frozen accounts, accusing her of overspending and ruining his credit. The perfect, glamorous marriage they paraded on social media shattered the exact second the free money stopped flowing. Then came the desperate threats. My personal phone vibrated on the table. It was a barrage of text messages from Eleanor. The first few messages demanded I fix whatever accounting glitch I had caused. When I did not reply, her tone shifted to raw, unhinged hostility. She typed in all capital letters, accusing me of hacking their accounts. She swore she was going to call the federal authorities, press grand theft charges, and drag me to prison for stealing the family money. I did not type out a defense. I did not explain the legality of the trust fund or my new ownership of the estate. I simply looked at her frantic, threatening paragraph, tapped the screen once, and sent a single, simple smiley face emoji. Then, I put the phone on silent. I knew that total lack of engagement would drive her to the brink of insanity. However, as I monitored their digital footprint, I noticed a very specific, alarming trend. The vendors for their upcoming investment gala were attempting to run massive deposit charges, and every single one was failing. This gala was Richard and Liam's master plan. They had invited dozens of billionaire venture capitalists, intending to woo them into investing millions into a fake, non-existent luxury resort project, without the funds to pay the caterers, the florists, and the string quartet. The event planners were threatening to cancel the party entirely. I stared at the screen, tapping my manicured fingernail against the glass desk. If the party was canceled, my family would simply hide in the mansion and quietly fade into bankruptcy. I could not allow that. They needed an audience. I needed them to stand at the absolute peak of their arrogance, surrounded by the elite society they worshipped, before I pulled the floor out from under them. I opened the administrative terminal and bypassed the global freeze. I carefully created a highly restricted, isolated credit perimeter. I authorized exactly $100,000 in available funds, but I geofenced the approval codes. The money could only be spent on event planners, luxury catering, imported flowers, and musicians. They could not withdraw a single dime in cash. nor could they use it to pay off Liam's violent debt collectors. I smiled, watching the red notifications slowly turn green as the gala deposits suddenly cleared. They would see this as a miraculous banking correction. They would believe they had won. I was giving them the exact amount of rope they needed to build their own gallows. Let them throw the party of the decade. I would be their uninvited guest of honor. The trap snapped shut precisely as I intended. Believing their financial crisis was nothing more than a temporary banking glitch. My family ravenously consumed the $100,000 credit line I had so graciously unlocked for them. They did not just spend the money, they burned it in a desperate, spectacular display of fake dominance. From the digital screens in my penthouse, I monitored the extravagant preparations transforming my mountain estate. Richard and Eleanor imported thousands of rare, white avalanche roses, cascading them down the grand mahogany staircases and draping them over the stone balconies. They hired a full 30-piece classical symphony orchestra to play in the grand hall. The driveway, which had been frozen solid just days ago, was now perfectly heated and lined with the sleek luxury sedans of every major billionaire venture capitalist in the greater Denver area. Richard was playing the ultimate host, pouring vintage champagne and pitching his non-existent luxury resort project to men who could fund it with a single signature. Then, Harper, of course, was capitalizing on the manufactured glamour. I watched her live broadcast from my tablet. She was standing in the center of the grand foyer, wearing a shimmering silver gown that she had definitely purchased before the total account freeze. She spun the camera around to show off the orchestra and the glittering crystal chandeliers. "Welcome to the event of the century, everyone," Harper purred into her phone, flipping her perfectly styled hair over her shoulder. "My family is officially launching our new alpine resort development tonight. We are so incredibly blessed." She paused, letting her smile drop into a mask of perfectly rehearsed, fake sorrow. She leaned closer to the camera lens, lowering her voice to a dramatic whisper. "I also want to thank all of you for your supportive messages regarding my older sister. It has been a very dark time for us. Mariana stole a massive amount of our family funds and abandoned us in the middle of a terrible blizzard. She ran away with her little boy, and we are just heartbroken. But we are choosing to rise above her toxic betrayal. Tonight is about the future." I turned the tablet face down on the glass table. A soft, genuine laugh escaped my throat. Her absolute commitment to the lie was almost admirable. She was publicly accusing me of the exact crime her husband and father had been committing for years. It was the perfect stage setup. I spent the late afternoon in total tranquility. I sat on the warm floor of the penthouse, building a towering castle out of colorful plastic blocks with Leo. My son clapped his tiny hands, his bright eyes shining with innocent joy. I kissed his forehead, savoring the pure, unbreakable peace of our secure sanctuary. I was leaving him in the capable, fiercely protective hands of his nanny for the evening. He would sleep soundly, entirely unaware of the storm his mother was about to unleash. As the sun dipped below the jagged mountain peaks, casting long, dark shadows over the city, my time for observation officially ended. I stepped into the master dressing room. I was no longer the exhausted, compliant risk analyst they had discarded in the snow. I shed the neutral, corporate colors I usually wore to blend into the background. Tonight, I dressed for a corporate slaughter. I slipped into a custom-tailored, razor-sharp suit in a deep, commanding shade of crimson red. It was the color of absolute power, the color of a warning sign, and a stark, violent contrast to the pristine white snow and the pale roses decorating my stolen home. I clipped a diamond watch to my wrist, strapped on a pair of black leather heels that sounded like gunshots against the hardwood floor, and picked up the heavy legal folder Vance had given me. The bright red wax seal of the state court rested perfectly against the crimson fabric of my jacket. I took the private elevator down to the subterranean garage. Waiting for me in the harsh fluorescent lighting was a private tactical security team I had retained earlier that afternoon. These were not standard nightclub bouncers. They were a 12-man unit of former military special operations contractors, dressed impeccably in fitted black suits with discreet earpieces and completely unreadable expressions. The lead contractor, a towering man with cold, calculating eyes, opened the heavy door of an armored black luxury sport utility vehicle for me. "Are we expecting physical resistance, ma'am?" he asked, his voice a low, professional rumble. "I am expecting a temper tantrum," I replied coldly, sliding into the luxurious leather seat. "You are there to ensure nobody touches me when I take their entire world away." He nodded once, shutting the heavy door. The engines of the 3 black vehicles roared to life simultaneously, echoing like thunder in the concrete bunker. We rolled out into the freezing night, forming an intimidating, unbreakable convoy. We tore through the city streets and merged onto the dark, winding mountain pass leading up to Aspen. As we carved our way through the icy darkness, I looked out the tinted window. Up ahead, glowing like a beacon of false arrogance against the dark mountainside, was my estate. The party was reaching its absolute, euphoric peak. Richard was probably raising his crystal glass right now, toasting to a glorious future built on my grandfather's stolen money. I gripped the legal folder in my lap, my crimson nails digging slightly into the leather. They wanted a show. They were about to get the finale. The convoy of 3 heavily armored black vehicles did not even slow down as we approached the grand wrought iron gates of the Aspen estate. My tactical team simply used a heavy security override code to force the massive barriers open. We bypassed the stunned hired valets, our heavy tires crushing the imported white rose petals scattered across the heated circular driveway. I stepped out of the luxury sport utility vehicle. The freezing mountain wind immediately whipped at my hair, but the crimson suit I wore felt like an impenetrable suit of armor. I signaled the lead contractor, my 12 men, dressed in impeccable black suits and earpieces, formed a tight wedge formation around me. We pushed open the massive custom oak doors. The grand hall was a blinding sea of glittering diamonds, tailored tuxedos, and crystal chandeliers. The 30-piece symphony orchestra was mid-crescendo, playing a beautiful, sweeping classical piece, but the heavy synchronized thud of my security team's boots striking the polished marble floor cut through the music like a knife. The lead contractor marched straight up to the stage and firmly grabbed the conductor's baton. The music halted with a screeching, dissonant crash. The silence that instantly followed was heavy and suffocating. Hundreds of the most powerful billionaires and venture capitalists in Denver turned in unison to stare at the woman in crimson red. Richard was standing near a towering champagne pyramid, holding a crystal flute and grinning wildly at a group of investors. His face morphed from smug, arrogant satisfaction to pure, unadulterated rage the exact second his eyes locked onto mine. He slammed his glass onto a silver tray so hard it shattered into pieces. "You ungrateful little brat," he roared, his voice cracking with fury, his face turning an ugly, mottled shade of purple. "How dare you show your face here? Get out of my house before I throw you out into the snow myself." He lunged across the floor, raising his heavy fist to strike me right in front of the entire elite society. He never even came close. Before I could even blink, 2 of my towering security contractors intercepted his path with brutal, terrifying efficiency. They grabbed Richard's arms, twisted them sharply and painfully behind his back, and forced his heavy body down. The sickening smack of his kneecaps hitting the solid marble floor echoed through the dead silent room. He let out a pathetic gasp of pain, his face pressed toward the ground, completely immobilized at my feet like a captured animal. The crowd of billionaires gasped, taking a collective, horrified step back. I did not even look down at Richard. I walked smoothly past his trembling form, the sharp click of my leather heels striking the stone with absolute authority. I approached the grand velvet podium where they had just been delivering their fraudulent investment pitches. I grabbed the silver microphone, turned to face the sea of shocked faces, and slammed the heavy legal folder onto the main banquet table. The red wax seal cracked loudly under the force. "Good evening, esteemed guests," I spoke, my voice echoing coldly and clearly through the massive hall. I apologize for interrupting this magnificent event, but as the sole, 100% owner of this property, I felt it was my legal obligation to inform you about the reality of the pitch you just heard. Frantic whispers immediately erupted across the room. I opened the folder, holding up the heavily stamped state deed for everyone to see. Every single inch of this Aspen estate, and the entire commercial real estate portfolio my stepfather has been trying to sell you tonight, belongs entirely to an independent blind trust that I control. Richard and Eleanor do not own the dirt under your expensive shoes. They have absolutely zero equity, zero liquid assets, and zero legal authority to offer you any investment whatsoever. You are currently being scammed by people who are entirely bankrupt and illegally trespassing on my private land. Harper stood completely frozen by the grand fireplace, her face draining of all color until she looked like a ghost. Liam, who had been hovering near the open bar, suddenly connected all the missing pieces: his violent gambling debts, the suddenly frozen credit accounts, the terrifying realization that the golden goose was not just dead, but never actually existed, hit him like a freight train. He scrambled forward, his eyes wide and wild with pure panic. He shoved past a wealthy investor and actually snatched the microphone straight from the podium stand next to me. "She lied to me," Liam screamed into the mic, his voice high-pitched and hysterical. Pointing a shaking finger directly at his wife, the entire room recoiled in disgust. "Harper told me she was the primary heir. She promised me the family money was secure. She is a liar and a fraud. You are all broke frauds." He threw the microphone onto the hardwood floor, causing a loud, piercing screech of audio feedback to fill the room. "I am completely done. I want a divorce right now. Harper, do not ever contact me again." He violently shoved his way through the crowd of stunned billionaires, sprinting out the front door and disappearing into the freezing night, abandoning his wife in front of high society without a single second thought. Harper collapsed onto a velvet dining chair, sobbing loudly and hysterically into her hands, but Eleanor, fully realizing the absolute, unrecoverable destruction of her social and financial life, broke completely. She dropped to her knees, crawling frantically across the marble floor, her expensive imported silk gown dragging through puddles of spilled champagne. She threw herself at my feet, her shaking hands desperately clutching the hem of my crimson skirt. "Mariana, please," she wailed, thick black mascara and tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face. "You cannot do this to us. I am your mother. We are family. I gave you life. I raised you. Please, you have to have some mercy on your own blood. Do not ruin us." I looked down at the pathetic, groveling woman clinging to my legs. The sheer, audacious hypocrisy of her words was nauseating. I gave a subtle nod to my security team. One of the massive contractors stepped forward and firmly pried her desperate hands off my suit, pushing her back onto the floor. I leaned down, lowering my voice so only she and the front row of terrified guests could hear the absolute, freezing venom in my words. "Family," I whispered coldly. "Where was this profound motherly love 24 hours ago when the temperature was -15 degrees? You shoved my suitcase onto the ice. You happily threw a single mother and her 1-year-old baby boy into a lethal blizzard so your spoiled youngest daughter could have a yoga room. And what did you give me to survive a torn, cheap motel coupon?" I stood back up tall, slowly adjusting the cuffs of my jacket. "You wanted me to freeze in the dark, so now you can burn in the light." The reaction from the elite crowd was instantaneous and utterly devastating. The ultra-rich do not tolerate public humiliation, and they absolutely despise poverty disguised as wealth. The venture capitalists, the billionaire developers, the elite socialites, they all turned their backs simultaneously. Loud scoffs of pure disgust echoed through the room. Men were already pulling out their phones, loudly canceling their investment pledges and ordering their private drivers to bring their cars to the front. Women pulled their expensive fur coats tight around their shoulders, side-eyeing Eleanor as if she were a highly contagious disease. Within minutes, the grand hall rapidly began to empty, the guests fleeing the toxic scene. They left Eleanor sobbing violently on the floor, and Richard groaning in pain under the boots of my guards, completely surrounded by dying white roses and the absolute, permanent collapse of their entire empire. The grand hall was nearly empty of the elite crowd, leaving only the wreckage of their shattered social standing. Just when it seemed the absolute destruction was complete, a sudden, desperate roar echoed from the floor. Richard, still pinned under the heavy boots of my security contractors, began thrashing wildly. "Let me go!" he screamed, his face red with a manic, cornered energy. "You think you have won, Mariana. You think a single piece of paper from Vance makes you untouchable." With a violent jerk, he managed to free one arm just enough to reach into the inner pocket of his ruined tuxedo. He pulled out a folded, heavily sealed parchment and threw it onto the marble floor. At that exact moment, the heavy front doors swung open again. In walked the local county sheriff, flanked by two armed deputies. Richard let out a breathless, triumphant laugh. He had known his accounts were failing earlier that day, and like the rat he was, he had prepared a desperate backup plan, heavily bribing the local law enforcement. "Sheriff," Richard yelled, pointing a shaking finger at me, "arrest this woman immediately. She is attempting to steal my estate. The document on the floor is the true, finalized contract signed by Harrison himself, transferring all assets directly to me just weeks before he died. Her trust fund deed is a complete fabrication." The sheriff, clearly acting on the payroll of my stepfather, stepped forward with his hand resting heavily on his utility belt. He looked at me with a stern, authoritative glare, completely ready to put me in handcuffs and drag me out of my own home. I did not flinch. I simply reached into my crimson suit pocket and pulled out a small, sleek metallic cylinder. I placed it gently onto the pristine surface of the banquet table and pressed the single button on its top. Instantly, a bright blue light shot upward, expanding and projecting a massive high-definition holographic video directly onto the blank, soaring wall of the grand hall. The entire room went dead silent as the towering, larger-than-life image of my late grandfather Harrison appeared. He was sitting in his leather study chair, looking directly into the camera with eyes as sharp and unforgiving as broken glass. "If you are watching this," Grandfather's recorded voice boomed through the hall, "it means I have passed away, and my worthless son-in-law, Richard, has just attempted to produce a forged transfer of deed." Richard froze completely, all the blood drained from his face, leaving him a ghastly, pale white. The sheriff stopped dead in his tracks, his hand slowly sliding away from his weapon. "Richard has always been incredibly predictable," Grandfather's hologram continued, a cold smile touching his lips. "He believes he can forge my signature and bribe local officials to steal what belongs to my granddaughter. But he is a fool. 3 years ago, I submitted my official, biometric original documents and my absolute final will directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, along with a mountain of evidence detailing Richard's corporate embezzlement. Any document he produces bearing a date after that is a federal forgery. Mariana, my dear, burn his fake empire to the ground." The hologram flickered and disappeared, leaving the massive room in a stunned, suffocating silence. The local sheriff looked down at the forged document on the floor, then looked at the terrified, trembling man pinned beneath my guards. The sheriff was corrupt, but he was not stupid enough to involve himself in a massive federal investigation with the Federal Bureau of Investigation to save his own skin. He made an instant choice. The sheriff walked over to Richard, pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs, and locked them tightly around his wrists. "Richard, you are under arrest for federal seal forgery and grand financial fraud. You have the right to remain silent." As they dragged a sobbing, defeated Richard out the front doors, I turned my attention to the two women cowering near the fireplace. Eleanor and Harper were trembling uncontrollably, completely stripped of their arrogance, their wealth, and their protectors. "Get out," I commanded, my voice slicing through the cold air. "Where will we go?" Harper cried, her voice cracking in genuine terror. "We have absolutely no money." I gestured to one of my security men. He walked over to the coat room and returned carrying a single, heavy suitcase. It was the exact same luggage they had thrown out into the ice earlier that week. He dropped it heavily onto the marble floor in front of them. "Take your bag and walk out that door," I told them coldly. "The temperature is dropping. I suggest you start walking fast." They had no choice. Weeping and clinging to each other, they dragged the heavy suitcase out of the warm, beautifully lit mansion and stepped straight into the brutal, freezing winter night. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind them, locking them out of my world forever. Months later, the absolute reality of their actions caught up with them. Harper, completely abandoned by her wealthy socialite friends and stripped of her fake online persona, took a job working the late-night janitorial shift at a discount shopping mall. Eleanor was forced into a tiny, run-down apartment in a dangerous, forgotten slum on the edge of the city, spending her days hiding behind locked doors, terrified of the violent debt collectors Liam had left behind. As for me, I stood on the grand stone balcony of the Aspen estate, wrapped in a warm cashmere shawl. The brutal winter had finally given way to a beautiful, vibrant spring. The mountain air was crisp and fresh. I looked down into the sunlit, blooming garden. My sweet baby boy, Leo, was laughing brightly as he took his very first clumsy steps across the soft green grass, safely guided by his nanny. I smiled, taking a deep breath of the peaceful air. I had successfully severed the toxic chains of my past, and now I held the absolute entirety of my own beautiful empire. Thank you so incredibly much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please let me know your city or country in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey and want to support the channel, please consider joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon. There, you can listen to our best, most exclusive true stories that are too intense to publish on YouTube. You can join us by scanning the QR code currently on your screen, or by clicking the Patreon link provided in the description and pinned comment. Stay safe and stay strong.